Hello there everybody, welcome back to the channel. Today we're doing a Godzilla tier list for y'all. I love the Godzilla franchise. I've seen every single Godzilla film, so we're going to rank them all, including Godzilla Kong, the New Empire. That's going to be here. I just saw it last night, so we're going to get to that one. Alright, let's just jump into the tier list right now, and it's an easy one to start off with. It's going to be the original Godzilla, 1954, one of the most influential movies of all time in a lot of different genres, sci-fi, horror, and of course the monster genre, so S tier, easily. Next up we have Godzilla Raids Again, which I think has not aged nearly as well as the original. It's not that great. I would drop this in C tier, and this was before it got really goofy later with the next one we have, which is King Kong versus Godzilla. This one has Kong in the first part of the name. This one's pretty dumb, pretty silly, but I did enjoy the fights here. It is a fine movie. I'm gonna drop this in the C tier as well. Next up we have Mothra versus Godzilla. Interesting that they decided to put Mothra's name before Godzilla's name in the title for this one. Mothra versus Godzilla is a big step up from King Kong versus Godzilla. They started to perfect the formula a bit here, so I'm gonna put Mothra versus Godzilla in the B tier. Next up is Ghidorah, the three-headed monster. This one is the introduction of obviously the famous King Ghidorah. King Ghidorah, one of the best Godzilla foes, and here it works really well. His powers, the effects, all of it is really well done and impressive for the time. This is also one of my favorite Showa era movies. I'm gonna put this in B tier as well. Next is the second Ghidorah film, Invasion of the Astro-Monsters. This one doesn't work for me as well. It's not quite as good. It's a little bit more on the sci-fi, a little less with the monsters, and I'm gonna drop it in C tier, but I would put it above King Kong versus Godzilla at the top of C right now. So next we have Ebirah, Horror of the Deep, which introduced Jun Fukuda to the directing role for Godzilla movies, and he would continue to direct quite a few of them coming up into the 70s. Ebirah, Horror of the Deep is an interesting one because it elevates the action in a lot of ways. It modernizes it a bit with the typical Showa era effects and guys in suits and sets and all that. Also, it gets really goofy with the story and the characters, even more goofy than usual. And I've never truly been a huge fan of Ebirah, also one of the least interesting foes for Godzilla in the Showa era. I would put it higher than Raids Again in C tier, but also behind King Kong in C tier as well. Next up is Son of Godzilla, the one that introduces Manila to the Godzilla universe for better or worse. This one is not that great. I never loved Son of Godzilla. It's fun and childish in that sense. Jun Fukuda also carries over to the direction here, but it's definitely the weakest of the Showa era that we've talked about thus far. Definitely a D tier. Next up we have Destroy All Monsters, which is one of my favorites of the Showa era. It's going in A tier. This was the first big, huge, epic team-up crossover Godzilla movie. It wasn't just one monster or Godzilla fighting a bunch of random other creatures. This had all the monsters, and it was pretty epic. The Avengers of the time. I loved watching it. So much fun. Got the classic sci-fi stuff that they added, like the aliens living in a mountain. This one is a lot of fun. Definitely an A tier. So we go from Destroy All Monsters to the similarly titled, but not even close to the same quality, All Monsters Attack. All Monsters Attack is one of the strangest Godzilla movies out there in a franchise full of weird ideas. This one mostly takes place in the mind of a child who's getting bullied, and he imagines Godzilla standing up to bullies, and Manila also speaks in Japanese. He has actual voice. This one's super weird, and not necessarily in a good way. It's going in the F tier. We changed direction again to Yoshimitsu Banno for Godzilla vs. Hedorah, and it's one of the biggest changes in style we see in the Showa era. We get into the 70s now with Godzilla, and this movie is a bit more intense. It's got some bloody corpses on the ground, skeletons out killed by Hedorah. There's also some great action scenes and a brand new monster for Godzilla to fight. It also goes more political with its story, going back to kind of the original style of storytelling, and I appreciated that return to elevated human characters and human story, as well as great monster action. This is an easy A tier as well. Next up is Godzilla vs. Gigan, which is another return of King Ghidorah. This one's fine. I liked it more than I think other people do. It's an enjoyable Godzilla romp for me, but it goes back to a lesser side of the Godzilla universe where we had Godzilla vs. Hedorah, great monster action, great characters, good story. This one ditches the characters of the story. This is only monster action, and it goes for the 70s kind of sci-fi aesthetic. This is a C-tier movie as well. I would put it ahead of Ebirah because I think Gigan's a little cooler than Ebirah. Next up is Godzilla vs. Megalon, or really should be Jet Jaguar versus Megalon. This one barely has any Godzilla in it. It favors this new robot character. This one's not that great. I don't love Megalon, and I don't love Jet Jaguar, unfortunately. I'm gonna put it in D tier, but it's ahead of Son of Godzilla. Next up, let's just do the two Mechagodzilla movies back to back. We've got Mechagodzilla, or Godzilla versus Mechagodzilla, a really strong return to the kind of Showa, simple Showa era, but with cool monsters, and obviously Mechagodzilla, classic design, very neat, and I think a good evolution from what they were trying to do with Jet Jaguar. I would put this one in the B tier as well. It's behind Ghidorah though for me, but I do really like Terror of Mechagodzilla because it takes the human characters and it adds actually a little bit elevated story. There is some genuine emotion here, and in my opinion, I think it worked pretty well. For me, this will go at the top of B, actually. So the Godzilla franchise went dormant for about 10 years and then returned with the aptly titled The Return of Godzilla. The Return of Godzilla is also a return to the original formula. This is in many ways a reimagining of the original, but for the modern era of the 80s at the time. Godzilla is the villain once again here. The effects are better. Everything's better than it used to be in the Showa era, and it's a nice resurgence to the franchise. And for all those reasons, I actually would put this one in A. I like this movie quite a bit, and I would put it ahead of Hedorah, but behind Destroy All Monsters. Next up is Godzilla vs. Biollante, another strong start to the Heisei era. This movie has great characters, a great story, an interesting sci-fi concept, also going back to the idea of stopping environmental damage. I appreciate what they went for here. It's almost an elevation in a way of the human side, but with also going back to Godzilla fighting other monsters. I have a hard time picking, and depending on the day, I go back and forth between The Return of Godzilla and Godzilla vs. Biollante. They're both very good movies. I would put this one in A, and for right now, I'm going to put it behind The Return of Godzilla. Next up is Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, and this is probably my least favorite of the Ghidorah titled Godzilla movies. There's a lot of reasons for this. I mean, it is goofy and cheesy. There's really bad acting in this one. The story is super over the top with time travel and all these other weird things. I just found the story an absolute mess. The characters were disaster. I really did not like any of the human side of this story. But what absolutely saves it is the monster fights. This has some great monster fights, and Ghidorah versus Godzilla never really gets old. So even though I'm not a huge fan of it, it still belongs in C tier, and I would put it ahead of Ebirah. After that, we have Godzilla versus Mothra, The Battle for Earth. This is a good one and a great evolution, in my opinion, of the original Mothra versus Godzilla for the Heisei era. As much as I love the classic stuff, and I'm a big fan of old movies, I like to appreciate what they were doing back then. This is a step above. I would put it in B still, but it's above Mothra versus Godzilla for me at the top of B. We have another Mechagodzilla movie, this time with Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla II. Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla II has one of the dumbest stories in the Heisei era. It really is really dumb. But it has some great action, some really cool moments, and I did like the fight scenes in this. There were some really impressive shots, some cool sequences. I'd put this in B as well. I enjoy the Mechagodzilla character, but it would be bottom of B. After that, we got Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla, and a cool design for Space Godzilla. Like, I think it's a pretty impressive, neat design, but this movie is also pretty dumb, and the monster fights aren't quite as good as the other things that have come before in the Heisei era. For me, this is a C tier movie easily, and I would actually put it just barely ahead of Godzilla Raids Again. But the Heisei era ended here with easily the best movie in the era, and that is Godzilla vs. Destoroyah. This is one of the best kaiju fight-centric movies of all time. Easily an A tier, and I would put it at the top of A. Tempted, honestly, to put it close to S, but I do think the original Godzilla and then the other things I will put in S are so superior to everything else in A that I'm going to keep that boundary, but this is a great monster-only Godzilla movie. We go from the culmination of an era of Godzilla to the beginning, I guess you could say, of an era for the American versions of Godzilla, and this is Roland Emmerich's 1998 Godzilla, which sucks. I hate this movie. It's so bad in every way, not just Godzilla's design, but obviously the effects that don't age well at all. The acting is terrible, the story's terrible, characters are terrible, everything is dumb. There's so many stupid things like Godzilla hiding in the sewers. So many dumb things. I don't like this movie at all. Easily F tier. Then we have the start of the Millennium Era, and I do like the Millennium Era, although I think it is the weakest generally of the three eras. But Godzilla 2000 is an interesting one, because this is an average movie in my opinion in almost every way, and because of that I'm gonna drop it in C tier. But there are some really cool shots in the final battle, specifically the move to CGI for the main villain again that fights against Godzilla. Not my favorite. It's worse even maybe than Godzilla 98. The story is also very basic and simple. This is a story I feel like I've seen a million times in Godzilla. But then the Millennium Era gets worse with Godzilla versus Megaguirus, which I think is one of the worst movies in the franchise. It is a D tier for me, not quite as bad as All Monsters Attack or 98. Then after that, the Millennium Era has its crown jewel, which to me is Godzilla, Mothra, and King Ghidorah, Giant Monsters All Out Attack, which is the best title by far of any Godzilla movie ever. This is a really awesome, fun movie, has the best fights of the Millennium Era, just really cool from start to finish. A solid story as well, decent characters, a solid story. This is an A tier Godzilla movie for me, and I would put it right above the Return of Godzilla. Next is the final titled Mechagodzilla movie. He does show up in other things, but Godzilla against Mechagodzilla. I guess they didn't want to call it Godzilla versus Mechagodzilla 3 for some reason. Godzilla against Mechagodzilla is the same shtick we've seen a bunch of times, but I told you, Mechagodzilla just works for me. I'm gonna put this in the bottom of B. Then Tokyo S.O.S, which to me was a big step down. I didn't like this really at all. I just thought it was boring. It's short, its characters aren't very good, and in a way I think it's pretty darn disappointing. I'm gonna put it at the top of D tier. It's just so meh, it's so average, and it just doesn't do anything new with the series. But then we get the one that just says screw it, the Millennium Era is over, we're going out with a bang, and it's Godzilla Final Wars, which is unlike anything in the entire franchise, and there will never be another Final Wars. This movie is insane. I feel like you can't really enjoy this to the fullest if you haven't seen all these other Godzilla movies, which in a way I guess does make it less accessible. And if you haven't seen any of these other Godzilla movies and you watch this, I'd imagine you would think it's one of the weirdest, weakest, maybe worst movies you've ever seen in your life. But because it has so much love for the franchise, because it does so many things that pay homage to everything I've watched before. Like if you start with 1954 Godzilla, you go all the way to Final Wars, 50 years worth of Godzilla, I think you'll be pretty happy with the way this decided to pay homage to almost everything that ever exists. And it also makes Godzilla really, really awesome. There's some great fights. He's just wrecking everybody. He's very overpowered in this. The human story, though, is the thing that you can take or leave depending on who you are. It's like a ripoff of like Mortal Kombat and The Matrix, definitely. But a bunch of weird like 90s movies, early 2000s style. Like there's some like Jason X feel to this. It's dated. The acting is also absurd, especially the American actors they brought into this. It's such a throwback to the Showa era though, with the aliens, with, you know, the whole idea of alien invasion and are they really our friends and helping us out. Then you've got the crazy monster fights. It's such a weird one to rank. Like in some ways this can be one of the worst Godzilla movies ever, in some ways it can be one of the best. I'm going to put it towards the top of my B. I really enjoyed watching this. We're going to skip 2014 for now, and we're going to go to Shin Godzilla, which is directed by Hideaki Anno of Evangelion fame, and also just did the pretty awesome Shin Kamen Rider as well. Shin Godzilla is interesting because it lacks a lot of Godzilla. It's a lot of boardroom meetings and politics and discussions and military discussions and how do we deal with a threat like this. Definitely a lot of social commentary in this movie, but a lot of the best Godzilla movies do have heavy social commentary. I can understand people who don't like this because it is a lot of talking and less Godzilla, but when Godzilla's on screen, he's awesome. It's so cool. I'm not a massive fan of the eye design for Godzilla here, but I do like the rest of the design for the character. And as well as it just is, it's one of the best stories and I think one of the best acted Godzilla works ever. For me, it's not quite S tier, but I'm going to put it at the top of A. So now let's get to the American Godzilla movies, and we're gonna rank all 4 of them here. This is a weird franchise for me because it's so mediocre, but at the same time so fun for the most part, that every time I see one, I go, that one's my favorite, that one's my favorite, that one's my favorite. Godzilla 2014 is easily the most grounded. It's the best in terms of character, best in terms of story. It does focus and prioritize character and story like the 54, but it also has way less Godzilla than maybe any other movie to date in this franchise. It is lacking, but Godzilla is awesome when he's there, so it's really disappointing in that way, but I still think it's a good movie, and because it's a good movie, I'm going to put it at the bottom of B. Then we get to Godzilla King of the Monsters, which I think personally is arguably the weakest movie of the series. I do think it rides the line of between Gareth Edwards' 2014 Godzilla and what Adam Wingard would go on to do with Godzilla vs. Kong and then Godzilla Kong, the New Empire. It rides that line because it wants to show a lot of monsters, but it also cuts away from the monster fights to the humans way too often, in my opinion. It also very rarely gives the monster perspectives from the fights. A lot of times you're looking up from the human perspective, like, oh no, they're about to stomp on us, instead of just showing the monsters fighting, which is what I feel like they should have done. This one is beautiful, though. It looks really amazing. It's got impressive visuals, and I think it's a pretty strong movie from that side. The CGI here is also excellent. Like, the monsters all look really, really good. This one I really go back and forth on because I don't think it's a very good movie, but it also has some cool fights, but not enough, and in a way, because it doesn't commit to one thing or the other, I'm gonna put it in C because it's a little disappointing from multiple different angles. It's like the human stuff is not good enough to carry the movie, but also the monster stuff is not all in like the most recent 2. Next is Godzilla vs. Kong, and this is when the MonsterVerse really goes all in on the monster stuff. They heard the people complaining, hey, no more humans, all monsters, and they really go all monsters. The humans here are awful. The human characters, so dumb. The stories are all really dumb, but the monster fights are great. And every time Godzilla and King Kong fight, it's awesome. Very cool sequences, some great settings and staging for different fights as well. Also love the inclusion of Mechagodzilla, obviously. And so this one is hard to rank as well. I like this movie. It is a little bit more Kong-centric than it is Godzilla-centric, and that's the same for this newer Godzilla Kong movie as well. But I did enjoy myself watching this. Maybe it was because one of the first movies I saw outside the pandemic, but I'm gonna put it at the bottom of B here also. So we have the surprise Godzilla Minus One, which I didn't know was coming out until that trailer last year when it dropped, and like, oh, it looked pretty good. This movie is incredible. I mean, I'm not gonna say anything that nobody else has already said. I did get to go to the fan screening for this before it dropped, and I was hyping everybody up, telling all my friends, you gotta see Minus One, because this is arguably the best Godzilla movie ever. I am, like I said earlier, a big fan of old movies, and I like to see how franchises started, what influenced the rest of the franchise, and Godzilla 54 is the start of everything. It started the formula, it started the great characters formula, great story formula, the politicals formula. This started the idea of making Godzilla a byproduct of important things going on in the world. When you have a kamikaze pilot as the main character, it's not something I was expecting. This movie's heavy, and I love that. It's one of my favorite sci-fi movies of the last probably 15 years. It's one of the best kaiju movies ever, arguably the best Godzilla movie ever. Maybe my favorite, but I'm gonna put it like I wish you could overlap them because they're both masterpieces in my opinion. But Godzilla Minus One, absolutely S tier, and I think Godzilla 54 and Minus One are so much better than everything else in this tier list that's why they're the only 2 things I'm putting in S. So that gets us to the brand new one, Godzilla Kong, the New Empire, which I've struggled to say multiple times throughout this video. This is a really fun movie. I had a blast with this, where Godzilla versus Kong had, some human characters and tried to still have a little bit of story. This one, basically no story at all. It's like almost 50-50 with the screen time between humans and monsters. The story here is probably the dumbest it's ever been out of the 4 MonsterVerse movies. Like, there's some ridiculous things that happen in this, but also the fights are arguably the best of the entire MonsterVerse. Even though we don't have iconic monsters for Godzilla and Kong to fight, there are new monsters that I thought were pretty cool, and I enjoyed all the fight sequences. This is also a Kong movie. A lot of people have been talking about that online. This is a Kong heavy movie, and I agree. And that way it's also kind of hard to rank in a Godzilla tier list because it is so Kong heavy. But Godzilla is so cool when he's here. He has so many great moments, including the beginning and mostly in the last 25-30 minutes. That's where Godzilla is the heaviest in this movie, but he has epic moments and his powers are unbelievable in this. I have a super hard time ranking this. In a way, it's my favorite of the American Godzilla movies because it's just like, hey, we're gonna embrace the Showa era. We're gonna make all the characters just ridiculous little plot devices, and then we're gonna do some really fun action, and you guys are gonna enjoy it. And I did. It's the shortest of the American movies. I'm gonna put it in my B, and really all three of these in B I think can overlap. Right now I'm gonna put it above Godzilla 2014. I'm probably recency bias. I literally just saw it, but yeah, I had a blast watching it. I think it's a fun juxtaposition, and obviously very indicative of the franchise to have -1 versus having a movie that's monster driven that also has some humans every once in a while. So thank you so much for watching this video. Again, make sure you like the video. Helps me out a lot. Subscribe to the channel for more content just like this. I'm going to do a bunch more tier lists on the channel. Let me know in the comments what you'd like to see next. Comment below. Let me know your Godzilla rankings. What are your favorite Godzilla movies and least favorite Godzilla movies? What'd you think of my rankings? Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all next time.